all former U.S. presidents who owned slaves. At the end of this video, I will reveal 8 former U.S. presidents who actually owned slaves while they were in office in the White House. Number 1. George Washington. At age 11, Washington inherited 10 slaves. Black men, can you imagine being called boy by an 11-year-old boy? He owned about 317 slaves in Mount Vernon, Virginia, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Washington opposed slavery privately, but he kept slaves until his death. He freed only 123 of his slaves in his will. Number 2. Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson inherited slaves at the age of 21 after his father died in 1757. Thomas Jefferson owned over 600 slaves in Monticello and other Virginia sites. Jefferson privately condemned slavery, but publicly opposed international trade while controlling his own slaves. Jefferson worked his slaves hard. He ran a nailery, which is a nail factory business, where enslaved boys and young men, ages 10 to 21, worked 10 to 14 hours every day, making up to 10,000 nails per day. Jefferson preferred not to separate slave families, but sold 100 plus slaves to clear his debts. Number 3. James Madison. James Madison inherited over 100 slaves from birth, and he supported colonization. Madison controlled slaves at his Mount Pellier plantation in Virginia and at the White House. James Madison freed absolutely 0 slaves in his will, but Madison's wife, Dolly, sold many slaves after Madison's death. Madison's slave named Paul Jennings worked at the White House and wrote an early memoir. Number 4. James Monroe. James Monroe inherited 75 slaves as a young adult in Highland, Virginia. Monroe supported colonization and the Missouri Compromise. James Monroe freed few or none of his slaves. Enslaved labor built James Monroe's estate and served his White House needs. Number 5. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson first owned slaves in 1804 at the age of 37 by purchasing and trading for land or money. Andrew Jackson owned 95 slaves as President of the United States. He owned 150 slaves by his death and owned 300 slaves in his lifetime in Hermitage, Tennessee. Andrew Jackson was strongly pro-slavery, extremely brutal in his practice of slavery, and very active in the slave trade by moving slaves between states, so families were often separated during slavery. Andrew Jackson posted 300 lash bounty ads for his runaway slaves, which instructed up to 100 lash whippings as punishment upon the return of that runaway slave. Andrew Jackson even treated enslaved troops harshly after battle post-war. Number 6. Martin Van Buren. He inherited slaves early in his life. Van Buren lived in New York, and his one slave escaped in 1814. He later opposed the expansion of slavery, which is the spread of slavery into new U.S. territories and states. Van Buren later opposed slavery politically. Number 7, William Henry Harrison inherited a small number of slaves. He owned 11 slaves in Virginia and sold no slaves while he was in the White House. Number 8, John Tyler. He inherited 70 slaves while he was in his 30s in Virginia and in the White House. He was a strong pro-slavery advocate and sold slaves to fund his political campaigns. He is also rumored to have fathered enslaved children, and they say it is unconfirmed. So they say. Number 9, James K. Polk. He inherited and purchased slaves, 25 slaves by the age of 30, in the Tennessee area, and Polk was pro-slavery expansion. He was considered an absentee slave owner, which means that he allowed his overseers to completely run and control his slaves without him being there. Polk freed his slaves after, in his will, after his wife died. And Polk portrayed himself as a benevolent slave owner. Can you believe it? Since he once shot an overseer for harshly whipping a slave. Still, is it even possible for a slave owner to be considered benevolent? You let me know in the comment section. Number 10, Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor inherited and accumulated slaves by the age of 20. He owned more than 150 slaves. He owned more than 150 slaves in Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana. He was a plantation owner but opposed slavery expansion, and Taylor was the last president to own slaves in the White House. Number 11, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson purchased his first enslaved man in 1837 at the age of 29 years old. He owned about 8 slaves in Tennessee and was pro-union and anti-empowerment of Black Americans. He freed his enslaved people in 1863 as a military governor, and it is rumored that Johnson treated some of his slaves as free employees post-war. Andrew Johnson he appointed his ex-slave to the Freedmen's Bureau. And number 12 is Ulysses S. Grant. He owned one slave named William Jones before the Civil War while he was in his 30s in the Missouri area. Grant was an emancipation supporter and called slavery a stain to the Union. So, who were the 8 presidents who owned slaves while in office? Well, it was all the rest except Martin Van Buren, who did not bring slaves into the White House, William Henry Harrison, who died 31 days into office, with no records showing of any slave ownership during his very short term, Andrew Johnson, who freed his slaves in 1863 before he became president in 1865, and Ulysses S. Grant, who freed the one slave that he did have in 1859 before he became president in 1869. These 12 former presidents of the United States of America who owned slaves owned human beings, not to be mistreated and devalued as mere property. The reputations of these 12 former presidents of the United States of America will forever be stained. I want to thank those of you who suggested this topic. You are greatly appreciated. And If you haven't already, click like and subscribe. I am working on becoming monetized on this channel, and all of your support helps me in that direction. And share this link on your social media with someone who you know needs to learn their history. Remember, know your history, and thank you for watching.